single chime, and a deadly truth hidden in the tower's shadows. Welcome to Mystery Parlour. I am your host, Axen. Tell me where you're listening from today. Your comments always make these mysteries feel alive. Now, into the story. In the long, untroubled history of Flaxborough's annual early summer floral display, the gravest mishap had traditionally been the wilting of Mrs. Krupp's alpine violets during an especially damp year. Thus, when the citizens assembled beneath the canvas marquee in the market square that mild Saturday morning, none possessed the slightest expectation of witnessing anything more alarming than the vicar's fondness for yellow roses or Councillor Frobisher's customary confusion over horticultural Latin. The marquee itself sagged in the middle, as it had for the past 15 seasons, despite assurances from the organising committee that next year certainly a new ridgepole would be procured. Beneath it, Flaxborough's gardeners moved with the gentle self-importance of people who believed that keeping begonias alive through April frosts demonstrated a robustness otherwise absent in their physiques. It was at precisely 10:30, just as the mayor was preparing to declare the display open with his customary remark about growth in our community, that a sound rose from the direction of St. Crispin's Clocktower. It was not the familiar chime which normally told the half-hour in a tone both resigned and faintly apologetic. Instead, what drifted across the square was a metallic clatter, a rolling, reverberating tumble, like a sack of scrap iron being dragged down a stone staircase, punctuated near the end by a single, crisp thud. Mrs. Krupp, who prided herself on her nerves, let out a small squeak. Mr. Podmore, polishing the glass cover of his prize marrow, froze mid-buff. Even the mayor, who rarely allowed external events to intrude upon the issuing of his prepared remarks, paused and glanced over his spectacles. "Well," he said eventually, "that was unusual." A murmur swelled through the crowd. Not alarm, exactly, but that irritable curiosity evoked by any event which threatens to upstage a flower show. "It came from the tower," whispered Miss Teversham, a retired schoolmistress who considered herself something of an authority on ecclesiastical acoustics. "Something's fallen. Or someone." She said the last word with quiet relish, as if the very possibility of a human mishap might finally bring some drama into her well-organized life. Inspector Walter Purbright, who had been admiring a modest arrangement of daisies submitted by the local brownie troupe, raised his head at the commotion. He waited a moment, for patience was, in his view, as useful a tool as any notebook, and watched the character of the crowd shift. There was an unmistakable transition from benign civic enjoyment to that skittering edginess which suggested an appetite for the mildly sensational. "Odd sound, sir," murmured Sergeant Malley at his shoulder. "Very," Purbright agreed, "though I dare say the tower has many loose parts. Age, wind, gravity, the usual saboteurs." Malley grinned. "Shall we have a look?" Purbright nodded and began making his way out of the marquee, apologizing as he passed those who felt their personal space had been compromised by this sudden police movement. He did not hurry. He had learned long ago that in Flaxborough, haste only encouraged speculation, and speculation was always 4 steps louder than truth. As the inspector crossed the square, he noticed Councillor Frobisher trotting briskly toward the church, his expression earnest enough to suggest he intended to claim responsibility for any explanation the moment it became fashionable. Behind him, several townspeople had fallen into an informal procession, eager to be among the first to discover what the noise might signify. St. Crispin's churchyard was cool and silent in contrast to the bustling square. The clock tower loomed above, its stonework weathered, its narrow windows blinking down with a faintly reproachful air. A few pigeons complained from the ledges. At the base of the tower, the heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar. Purbright noticed this before anyone else, though he refrained from comment. The door, usually kept locked, except during maintenance, bore a fresh scrape near the hinge, as if pushed open with greater force than advisable for 189-year-old timber. "Reckon someone forced their way in," Mally murmured. "Reckon," Purbright replied quietly, "that we should look before we conclude." He gently nudged the door wider. A cool draught wafted out, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and metal oil. The narrow spiral staircase within was dim but not entirely dark. A spill of sunlight from an upper opening revealed small flakes of rust scattered across the steps, shimmering like iron filings. Purbright lifted one flake with a fingertip. "Fresh," he said. Mally blinked. "Fresh rust, sir?" "As contradictions go," Purbright replied, "it is among the more cooperative ones." They ascended a few steps, enough to see that something had indeed fallen. Approximately halfway up the tower, lodged awkwardly against the inner curve of the wall, lay a twisted assemblage of gears, brass rods, and what looked to be a shattered pendulum. It had clearly once formed part of the clock's mechanism, but the mechanism had not fallen alone. Near it, face down, motionless, limbs askew like a marionette dropped by a careless puppeteer, lay a man. Purbright stood still for several seconds, allowing the silence to thicken around the discovery. His expression did not change. One eyebrow, perhaps, rose by a fraction of its usual restraint. Behind him, Miss Teversham, who had successfully inserted herself into the investigative procession, let out a soft gasp. "Oh, dear," she whispered. "I did say someone, didn't I?" Purbright descended the step he had taken, placing himself between the body and the onlookers as gently as a man shielding a small embarrassment. "Sergeant," he said calmly, "I believe we must fetch Dr. Hilliard, and perhaps the vicar, though not, I think, in that order." As Mally hurried off, Purbright allowed himself a slow breath. The fallen man's clothing, a dark workman's coat, frayed at the cuffs, suggested a caretaker or tradesman. His posture, however, suggested less accident and more arrangement. Purbright did not touch the body. He did not need to. A small, peculiar detail had already drawn his eye. One of the man's hands was curled not in reflex, but in a deliberate, almost dainty grip, and between the fingers, faintly smudged with dust, lay a tiny fragment of white paper, torn as if from a much larger sheet. Purbright leaned in just far enough to see what was written upon it. A single ink stroke, curved, decisive, part of a letter, perhaps, or a symbol. Behind him, the first whispers began to rustle through the churchyard, like wind in the hedges. A man dead in the clock-tower, a mechanism shattered, a half-hour marked not by chime, but by calamity. And Purbright, listening with polite detachment, knew at once that Flaxborough would not return to its flowers so easily. Inspector Purbright waited at the base of the tower, while Sergeant Mally went to fetch Dr. Hilliard, the churchyard grass unmoving under the faint warmth of the morning sun. A small cluster of onlookers gathered a few respectful paces away, their curiosity wrestling with their sense of propriety. Miss Teversham, of course, hovered closest. She had stationed herself where she could claim, should anyone later dispute it, that she had been instrumental in alerting the authorities to the presence of tragedy. Purbright gave her a polite nod. She returned it with the solemnity of someone witnessing the first unfolding of historical significance. The inspector's attention, however, remained fixed on the faintly open tower door and the narrow stairway within. There was something decidedly unaccidental about the disorder he had glimpsed. A fall, yes, but one preceded by an interruption, perhaps a struggle, certainly a disruption of the clock's mechanism that suggested more than mechanical coincidence. Dr. Hilliard arrived at last, puffing slightly and carrying the small metal case that accompanied him on all official occasions, including those where he suspected his services would be unnecessary, but enjoyed being asked. With him came Mr. Peebles, the church verger, a tall, nervous man whose expression now combined shock with a hint of personal affront, as though the deceased had intruded upon his property without proper consultation. "Inspector," Hilliard greeted breathlessly, "I understand there's been, well, something of a mishap?" Purbright inclined his head. "A man has fallen inside the tower. He appears to be dead. I'd be grateful for your confirmation." Hilliard nodded grimly and ascended the steps, Peebles close behind until Purbright raised a gentle hand that halted the verger mid-stride. "Perhaps best to limit the number of observers for the moment, Mr. Peebles." Peebles looked wounded. "It is the Lord's property, sir." "Indeed," Purbright said, "and I should hate for us to add trampled stair treads to today's misfortunes." The verger backed away, chastened in such a fashion that it was unclear whether he deferred more to Purbright's logic or the imagined displeasure of the Almighty. Within a few minutes, Hilliard reappeared, one hand gripping the stair rail as though the climb had been less physically demanding than emotionally disorienting. "It is as you thought," he murmured. "Neck broken. Death quite immediate, I'd say." "Natural fall?" Purbright asked, already suspecting the answer. Hilliard hesitated. "Difficult to say. The mechanism seems to have collapsed around him. A rather peculiar arrangement, really. I would almost think the machinery fell first and he afterwards." "Thank you, Doctor." Hilliard left to complete the necessary paperwork, a task he always undertook with funereal reverence, while Purbright allowed himself a slow exhale. Machinery rarely fell on cue, and even less frequently on people who happened to be alone in a tower with a door forced open. Sergeant Malley returned just as Hilliard departed, having dispatched a constable to keep the churchyard clear. "Doctor thinks he broke his neck in the fall," Malley reported. "So it appears," Purbright replied quietly, "though I should be interested to know what persuaded a man to venture into the tower during the flower show, and with such poor timing. Do we know who he is, sir?" "Not yet, but the coat suggests he's no casual visitor." He paused thoughtfully. "Has the vicar been informed?" Malley nodded. "I sent young Pritchard to fetch him from the tea tent. He was judging sponge cakes." "A task," Purbright murmured, "requiring a delicate temperament. Let us hope he adjusts quickly." Moments later, the Reverend Crispin Elgrange hurried toward them, complexion rosy with exertion and the lingering afterglow of sponge cake sampling. He stopped before Purbright, adjusting his clerical collar with an air of gathering dignity. "Inspector," the vicar said, "I understand there has been a situation of some gravity." "There has," Purbright replied. "A man has been found dead inside the tower." Elgrange turned pale. "Dear me. That tower is hardly in fit condition for private climbing. We've been waiting for the council to approve repairs for months. Tragic accident, no doubt." "Quite possibly," Purbright said, though in a tone that hinted other possibilities existed. The vicar dabbed at his brow. "Mr. Peebles assures me he locked the tower after winding the clock yesterday evening. At least he believes he did. Poor man feels dreadful about the whole thing." Purbright offered a small, reassuring smile. "This is unlikely to be Mr. Peebles's fault." "Bless you for saying so," the vicar sighed. "Still, who on earth was the unfortunate fellow?" "That," Purbright replied, "is what we mean to discover." He asked Malley to begin canvassing the square discreetly, asking whether anyone had seen someone heading toward the tower earlier. Meanwhile, Purbright climbed the stairs again, slower this time, letting his eyes absorb each scuff, each scrape, each displaced fleck of rust. The machinery lay as before, twisted, shattered, oddly dislodged from its long-accustomed position. The body, respectfully covered now by Hilliard's cloth, remained where it had fallen. But it was the small torn scrap of paper, still clutched between rigid fingers, that held Purbright's attention. A single curved ink stroke, smooth, intentional, not part of a torn invoice or a note hastily written. Something more deliberate, perhaps a symbol, letter, or flourish from a signature. Purbright resisted the urge to remove it just yet. Better to observe it as found. Descending once more, he met Mally returning with the first thin trickle of information. Several say they saw a man in a dark coat heading toward the tower around 10 o'clock, Mally reported, carrying a satchel, but no one recognized him. A satchel, Purbright repeated. Interesting. Did anyone see him leave it? No, sir. Nor does he have one now. Curious. Mally frowned. Someone might have taken it? Someone, Purbright echoed. Might indeed. The inspector turned his gaze toward the square. The flower show continued, albeit with a slight air of chastened excitement. People avoided staring at the churchyard even as they angled themselves subtly to see as much as decorum allowed. A dead man in the tower, a forced door, missing belongings, a scrap of deliberately marked paper, and all at the half-hour chime that never came. Purbright clasped his hands behind his back. "Sergeant," he said, "let's find out who winds the clock, who maintains it, and who might wish to interfere with either." The investigation, he knew, had only just begun. Purbright stood for several minutes at the churchyard gate, letting the quiet hum of the flower show drift back to its placid rhythm while his thoughts pressed gently inward, arranging themselves into orderly lines. No single detail yet carried weight enough to define the matter, but several were beginning to lean suggestively in one direction or another. Experience had taught him that a small tilt, given time, might prove more revealing than an outright confession. Sergeant Mally returned from his inquiries with the briskness of a man who felt progress was already forming in his wake. "I've spoken to Mr. Peebles in more detail, sir. He says the clock is usually tended by a Mr. Edwin Harting. Lives over near the old brewery lane. Retired electrician, semi-retired repairman, and, according to Peebles, perpetually irritated by the tower's condition." Purbright nodded. Did Peebles think today's visitor was Harting? Mally shook his head. Peebles says he didn't see the man, but he insists Harting never comes on Saturdays unless summoned. Unless, Purbright murmured, he had an unexpected reason. It seemed wise to speak with Mr. Harting before speculation thickened. The inspector sent Mally back to keep the churchyard undisturbed, then set out on foot along the quiet lane leading toward the older part of town. The houses here leaned politely inward, as if exchanging confidences above the heads of passers-by. Cats dozed on low walls, with the languid entitlement of creatures rarely contradicted. Harting's cottage emerged near the bend, a narrow structure with stubborn ivy clinging to its lower walls. Smoke curled from the chimney in a thin, undecided plume. Purbright knocked gently. After a pause long enough to suggest internal negotiation, the door opened. Edwin Harting appeared, a wiry man in spectacles that seemed permanently ready to slide off the bridge of his nose. His hair, mostly grey, stuck out in practical tufts. He regarded Purbright with cautious irritation, as though interrupted during some delicate operation. "Yes." "Mr. Harting," Purbright said mildly. "Inspector Purbright, Flaxborough Constabulary. May I trouble you for a few moments?" Harting blinked behind his lenses. "If it's about the bell chime, I've already told the vicar it needs funding, not prayers." "Not prayers," Purbright echoed with a faint smile. "Something rather more immediate. A man was found dead in the Clocktower this morning." Harting's face shifted. First surprise, then annoyance, then a sort of injured professional pride. "In the tower." "Doing what?" "That," Purbright said, "is partly what we hope to learn. Would you be able to tell me when you last serviced the mechanism?" "Yesterday evening. Gave it a quick inspection after winding it. Nothing unusual. Bit of stiffness in the secondary linkage, but I've been telling them about that for months." He squinted. "Who was he?" "Do you know?" "Not yet. He was wearing a workman's coat. Dark. Quite worn. I don't know anyone fitting that, and I certainly didn't send anyone up there." I'm the only one with the key except Peebles. But Peebles wouldn't go up. He gets dizzy on step ladders. Purbright nodded. Did you misplace your key at any point? Never. Harting touched his coat pocket reflexively. Always keep it here. Wouldn't trust anyone else not to drop it into the nave from sheer clumsiness. Purbright observed the gesture, carefully. And it has been there since yesterday evening. Harting hesitated. Just a flicker, but enough. He tapped the pocket again. Well, it wasn't out of my sight. I hung the coat in the hall while I had breakfast. Someone would have had to walk right past me to tamper with it. Do you receive many visitors? I receive precisely none, Harting snapped. Then, softening slightly. Not unless you count that charity fellow. What's his name? Lenton. Came yesterday with a subscription form. Wanted money for preserving civic heritage. He gave a dry snort. As if the council hasn't drained that well already. Purbright tucked the name quietly into his thoughts. Could Mr. Lenton have been left alone with your coat? Unlikely. He speaks quickly but moves slowly, hardly the sort to snatch keys. Purbright thanked him and wished him a calmer afternoon than his morning. Harting muttered something about incompetent councils and closed the door. Walking back toward the square, Purbright let his mind settle on the peculiar intersection of details. A man dead in the tower, a forced door, a missing satchel, a torn scrap of paper bearing a single curved stroke, and now the possibility of someone acquiring a key, or at least enough time alone with it to make a copy. When he reached the churchyard, Mally was speaking quietly with Constable Pritchard. The young constable stood awkwardly, uncertain whether to look stern or sympathetic. "There's someone asking to speak with you, sir," Mally said. "Mrs. Nora Drilling claims she might know something about the man." Purbright raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Drilling was not known for understatement. Her knowledge of local events was both expansive and heavily embroidered. She stood beside the lich gate, hands clasped over her handbag like a parishioner awaiting confession. When she saw Purbright approach, she straightened importantly. "Inspector," she said, her voice touched with self-importance, "I may have observed something of significance." "I'm grateful, Mrs. Drilling. What did you see?" "It was just before 10. I was arranging the teas, volunteer work, of course. They know they can rely on me. When I saw a stranger heading toward the church. He was carrying a brown satchel, looked as though he hadn't slept a full night. Pale, nervous." Purbright inclined his head. "Did he speak to anyone?" "No, not a word. Walked quickly too, as if afraid someone might call after him." "Did he look like a tradesman or a visitor?" Mrs. Drilling considered. "Not a tradesman, too tidy, but not a visitor either. He didn't look around as he walked. He went straight as though he knew exactly where he meant to be." Purbright thanked her and gently dissuaded her from embellishing further. She seemed faintly disappointed but accepted his polite barrier. He rejoined Mally near the tower door. "A stranger who knew where he was going," Purbright murmured. "Carrying a satchel and ending up dead beside shattered machinery." Mally scratched his head. "Someone lured him up there, sir." "Or someone followed him," Purbright said. Either way, he had a purpose. He looked toward the tower once more, its silent face offering no assistance. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "I believe it's time we locate Mr. Cyril Lenton and inquire why civic heritage required his attention yesterday morning." The day, it seemed, was determined to provide Purbright with more threads than hands to hold them, but threads, once found, had a habit of pulling themselves taut. Purbright and Sergeant Mally made their way across the square, the last murmurs of Mrs. Drilling's account still hovering like midges in the warm air. The flower show had settled back into its slow, amiable rhythm, though every few minutes someone cast a tentative glance toward the churchyard, as if half expecting the tower to suddenly confess its secrets aloud. Purbright noted the sideways glances without irritation. In Flaxborough, curiosity was both a communal pastime and a civic duty. Cyril Lenton, as Purbright recalled, operated his subscription drives from a small office above Galloway and Sons, the printers. Mally walked at his side with purposeful strides, though occasionally lengthening them in an attempt to match the inspector's unhurried pace. Purbright seemed to drift, letting his gaze slip from shop-front to passer-by, as though the answers he sought might be hiding behind a display of knitted coasters or lurking beneath the chalk prices of cauliflower. The narrow stairway to Lenton's office was steep enough to serve as an early deterrent to those reluctant to part with their money. Purbright climbed it steadily, pausing only to tap lightly on the frosted glass door labeled Civic Preservation Initiative. "Enquiries, welcome." From inside came a muffled shuffling, followed by a thump and a muttered curse. The door opened to reveal Cyril Lenton, a young man with sandy hair and spectacles too large for his narrow face. He wore a tie that attempted optimism but failed halfway down the knot. "Inspector Purbright," the young man said, visibly startled. "Is something wrong? Has someone complained?" "I assure you I've been very polite about the subscriptions." Purbright offered him a mild smile. "Nothing of the sort at present. May we come in?" Lenton stepped aside at once, his expression shifting from surprise to an earnest anxiety that suggested a man terrified of being blamed for something he had not yet imagined. The office smelled faintly of glue, paper, and the peculiar despair of unreturned subscription forms. A stack of leaflets teetered beside a worn typewriter, and a half-eaten sandwich lay abandoned on a ledger. Purbright began without preamble. "Mr. Lenton, I understand you visited Mr. Harting yesterday." "Yes," Lenton replied, quickly. "He's one of the few people who still don't cross the road when they see me coming. I was hoping he might contribute to the preservation fund. He said no, rather firmly." "Did you remain in his home long?" 10 minutes, perhaps. Maybe less. He had tea brewing, but I think that was just coincidence. I wasn't offered any." "During that time," Purbright continued gently, "were you left alone in the hallway? Even briefly?" Lenton blinked. "Alone? Well, he fetched the subscription booklet I left with him last month. That took a moment. I suppose I was alone then." "Long enough to examine his coat?" The question hit Lenton like a poorly aimed custard pie. He gaped. "Coat? Good heavens, Inspector. I wasn't rifling through his clothing. I can barely persuade people to take a leaflet, let alone steal from them." Purbright nodded, pleased not by the answer itself, but by the immediate sincerity with which it had been spoken. "No suggestion of theft, Mr. Lenton. But you see, a man has been found dead in the Clocktower, and we have reason to think someone gained access unlawfully." Lenton paled. "Dead? In the tower?" "Indeed. But I haven't been near St. Crispin's all week. I've been canvassing along the high street, bakers, butchers, anyone who doesn't pretend not to see me. You can ask. I'd never use a church key." Purbright studied him for a long moment. The agitation was unmistakably genuine, the hands trembling not from fear of guilt, but fear of implication. "Thank you, Mr. Lenton," Purbright said at last. "Your information is helpful. One more thing. Do you recognize this description? A man carrying a brown satchel, pale, perhaps tired, heading toward the tower shortly before 10. Lenton shook his head at once. "No one like that approached me. If he had, I'd have handed him a leaflet." Purbright gave a small nod and stepped back. Lenton, uncertain whether to bow or flee, merely swallowed and murmured a wish that the investigation go smoothly. Outside again, Mally exhaled. "Doesn't seem the sort to break into towers, sir." "No?" Purbright agreed. "But he may have told us more than he realized." As they walked, Mally frowned. "You think someone took Harting's key while Lenton was visiting?" "A possibility," Purbright said. "A narrow window, but sufficient. Or perhaps someone watched Lenton go in, saw the opportunity, and followed." Mally halted mid-stride. "Followed him? To steal a key?" Or to confirm whether Harting was home, Purbright added mildly. Our visitor to the tower was purposeful. Mrs. Drilling said he walked as though he knew exactly where to be and when. A timed meeting, sir, or a timed interruption. They continued toward the constabulary, the late morning sun soft against the cobbles. Purbright paused near a row of market stalls. A boy nearby was winding a small tin toy, a clockwork soldier, that marched stiffly before collapsing into ticking stillness. Purbright watched it fall, and an idea drifted into place with almost tender clarity. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "how long does the clock tower mechanism take to wind down once tampered with?" Mally's brow furrowed. "Depends on where it's interfered with. Could be seconds, could be hours." "Indeed." Purbright resumed walking. "Our dead man may not have fallen because he was winding the clock. He may have arrived to find it already sabotaged." Mally opened his mouth, then closed it slowly, which means someone was up there before him. "Precisely." They reached the station, where a constable hurried over with a note. "Message from Dr. Hilliard, sir. He's identified the deceased." Purbright unfolded the paper. The name was unfamiliar. Mr. Albert Grevitt. Address, a boarding house near the railway yard. Occupation, itinerant watch repairer, recently arrived in town. A watch repairer, a man accustomed to dealing with gears, springs, fine mechanisms. Mally whistled softly. "A man like that would know how to tamper with the clock, sir." Or, Purbright murmured, how to recognize when someone else had already done so. He folded the note carefully. "Sergeant, we shall have a word with the landlady at this boarding house, and after that—" He glanced back in the direction of the church tower, its stone face inscrutable. "We shall return to St. Crispin's. I believe the clock has more to tell us." The day was ripening toward noon, but the mystery felt only just awakened. The boarding house stood just beyond the railway yard, a squat brick structure whose windows held the dull, slightly greasy sheen shared by all buildings that endure the soot of passing trains. A faded sign, "Rooms by the week," hung at a defeated angle. Purbright paused before entering, listening to the muted clatter of metal on metal from the sidings. It reminded him faintly of the sound that had rolled from the clock tower earlier that morning. Inside, the hall smelled of boiled cabbage and furniture polish. Mrs. Emmeline Bostwick, the landlady, appeared almost instantly, as though summoned by a bell only she could hear. She was a woman of considerable volume, both in shape and in conversational output, and her expression suggested she had prepared in advance a full account of whatever matter might have brought the police to her door. "Inspector Purbright, isn't it?" she asked, placing a firm hand to her bosom as though steadying herself for dramatic disclosure. "I knew something was amiss the moment Albert didn't come down for breakfast. He's punctual, you know, like a church bell." Purbright inclined his head. "I'm afraid we have some unfortunate news, Mrs. Bostwick." "Oh, I know he's dead," she said, with a tragic certainty that implied she had already rehearsed her grief, with some enthusiasm. "The moment the constable came knocking, I always said the poor man had a look about him, like those mournful canaries they keep in mines." Mally blinked. "Mines, ma'am?" Mrs. Bostwick waved this away. "You know the sort. Nervous creatures, sensitive to calamity." Purbright adopted his gentlest tone. "We're trying to understand the circumstances that led Mr. Grevitt to visit the clock tower this morning. Did he mention any intention of going there?" "Clock tower?" She frowned deeply. "No, Inspector. He said he had a calling, but I thought he meant from one of his customers. He's very sought after by the railway men. Their pocket watches are forever losing the will to keep time. Say, a calling," Purbright repeated softly. "Did he say who from?" "No names. Just that someone wanted something repaired urgently. He was uneasy about it, I thought. Not frightened exactly, but fluttery." She pressed her fingertips together. "He left early, didn't even touch his kippers." "Was he carrying a satchel?" Purbright asked. "Oh yes, always did. Tools and such. Wouldn't part with it. Purbright and Mally exchanged a look. The missing satchel was beginning to glow with increasing significance. "Did he receive visitors recently?" Purbright continued. "Anyone unfamiliar?" Mrs. Bostwick pondered this. "Yesterday evening there was a man who asked for him, a stranger, tall, with a sharp sort of face. Didn't give his name. I asked him to wait in the hall, but he said he'd return later. Seemed impatient." "And did he return?" "Not that I saw." She pursed her lips. "I don't like unknown callers. They upset the domestic atmosphere." Purbright offered his condolences and assured her the constabulary would handle matters with discretion. She insisted on showing them Albert Grevitt's room, which proved small, tidy, and obsessively ordered. The bed was crisply made, the wardrobe neatly arranged, and a little folding workbench sat by the window. A collection of tiny tools lay carefully wrapped in a cloth, those too large to fit into a satchel presumably. Something else caught Purbright's eye, a torn scrap of paper on the desk. He lifted it with care. The edge showed a curved stroke of ink, the other half of the torn note. "Sergeant," he murmured. Mally bent close. "So he tore it himself. Why?" "It may not have been voluntary," Purbright replied quietly, "or he tore it in haste. But look, the curve matches the one we saw in the tower." The writing was part of a larger symbol, perhaps even a crest or an ornate initial. Purbright tucked the scrap into an envelope. There was nothing more to learn here. As they left, Mrs. Bostwick called after them, "It's wicked, Inspector, wicked! A good man undone by clocks. Mark my words, that tower's cursed." The inspector thanked her politely, though he doubted curses were at work. Human nature tended to be quite sufficient. Outside, the sky had grown brighter, the railway yard humming with the steady rhythm of routine. Purbright paused at the corner of the lane. "Sergeant," he said, "a tall stranger calling for Grevitt, a satchel missing, a torn note, and sabotage in a tower known only to a few." Mally scratched his chin. "You think Grevitt was lured there, sir? To fix something, or to witness something?" "Perhaps to witness," Purbright said, "or perhaps to prevent." Buildings slid past them as they walked. Shops, terraces, the occasional unrepentant pub. The story forming in Purbright's mind was incomplete, but the edges of it were beginning to clarify. Someone had needed Grevitt. Someone had timed their actions carefully. Someone who knew the workings of St. Crispin's Tower, or at least understood what its silence at the half-hour might accomplish. Back at the churchyard, the constable on duty saluted. Purbright headed straight for the tower once more. He climbed the narrow stairs with the slow precision of a man allowing each thought to fall into place, with the same deliberate softness as his footsteps. The shattered clock mechanism lay untouched since morning. Purbright crouched beside it. There, among the gears, a faint scrape, fresh, sharper than the others. He lifted a small metal sliver. Not from the clock at all, but from a tool. A very fine tool. "A watchmaker's," Mally guessed from the step above. "Or someone pretending to be one," Purbright said. He stood, dusting his hands. The view from the narrow tower window stretched toward the square where the flower show bustled innocently. "Sergeant," he said at last, "we must find out who benefits from the clock's silence at 10:30. Mally blinked. "Benefits, sir?" Purbright looked again at the broken mechanism, the forced door, the missing satchel, the torn note. "In Flaxborough," he said gently. "Nothing is ever broken without someone hoping to gain from the pieces." The day pressed on. The town hummed, and the clock tower, far from silent, was beginning to speak. Purbright descended the tower steps once more, carrying with him the small metal sliver and the certainty that it did not belong among the old brass and iron of St. Crispin's clockwork. Mally followed a pace behind, looking increasingly troubled, as though the tower's dim interior had begun to impose upon him some quiet, ancient disapproval. Outside, the churchyard felt brighter, though the breeze had cooled. A few more curious residents hovered nearby, unable to resist the gravitational pull of tragedy. Purbright gave them a polite nod that conveyed both acknowledgement and deterrence. "Sergeant," he said, lowering his voice, "the sliver we found suggests a tool finer than anything Harting would use on the tower. Something from Grevitt's trade, perhaps." Mally frowned. "But why would Grevitt sabotage the mechanism? Makes no sense for a watch repairer to go breaking clocks." "Unless he went to prevent someone else from doing so," Purbright murmured, "and arrived too late." He started walking toward the high street without further explanation. Mally, accustomed to the inspector's gentle leaps of logic, followed without complaint. The path brought them past the town hall, whose stone porch now sheltered Councillor Frobisher and 2 other committee members. They stood in a loose knot, whispering with all the subtlety of a flock of geese, pausing only when Purbright approached. "Ah, Inspector," Frobisher exclaimed, puffing up as though he had been waiting precisely for this moment. "Terrible business at the church. Terrible. I trust you've identified the culprit by now." Purbright smiled blandly. "We've identified the deceased councillor." Frobisher faltered for only a second before recovering. "Ah, well, that's something, I suppose. This sort of thing can be terribly disruptive to civic activities. Timetables, you know. Coordination. Why, the flower show nearly lost half its attendees." Purbright regarded him mildly. "Did it?" "Oh, yes," Frobisher said, unaware he was being politely examined. "Word spread within minutes. People do enjoy a scandal. Shameful in a way. Distracting from the important events of the day." "Such as?" Purbright asked. "Well, the heritage proposal, Inspector. We were due to meet this morning to discuss the Council's allocation for the preservation initiative. Young Lenton's petition. He claims we must repair the Clocktower urgently and fund several restorations besides. Always asking for money, that one." "Was the meeting held?" Purbright asked, with careful neutrality. Frobisher glanced at his companions. "Postponed due to the commotion. The mayor felt it best to allow tempers to cool." "And were tempers warm this morning?" A flicker crossed Frobisher's features, something between irritation and embarrassment. "Somewhat. Harting, that clockwinder fellow, came to argue against spending funds on what he calls ornamental irrelevancies. Claimed the tower needed practical reinforcement, not cosmetic fluff. Very heated discussion. I left before they concluded." "Did Grevitt attend the meeting?" "Who?" Frobisher blinked. "The deceased." "Oh, no. Never seen him." "Who was he?" "A watch repairer," Purbright said casually. "Recently arrived in town. Quite skilled, it seems." Frobisher sniffed, unimpressed. "We have no need of more clock tinkerers. One is already too many." "Quite," Purbright murmured. "Thank you, Councillor. You've been helpful." Frobisher, uncertain whether this was praise or admonition, bowed slightly and retreated to the safety of his committee cluster. Mally exhaled softly. "Harting arguing with the council? About repairs?" "Quite vehemently, it appears," Purbright said. "And consider the timing. A dispute over funds for the tower, an incoming petition, a stranger arriving with tools, the mechanism sabotaged before the half-hour chime. Someone wished to demonstrate something or conceal it." "Conceal what, sir?" Purbright did not answer immediately. Instead, he led Mally toward the side street where Galloway and Sons displayed their printed notices. Among the flyers was one advertising the Preservation Fund. The emblem at the top was ornate, a looping decorative letter, larger than the others, almost pretentious. The same flourish appeared on the torn scrap in Purbright's pocket. "Sir," Mally said, spotting it too. "Lenton's leaflets." "Just so." Purbright gently lifted one from the holder. "These were printed yesterday. and each carries the same emblem, which means Grevett found himself holding part of a leaflet, or someone tore it from him. Mally's eyes widened. "You think he went to meet Lenton?" Purbright turned the leaflet over. "Possibly. Or someone used Lenton's materials knowingly. But why would Grevett tear the emblem? Or why would someone tear it from him?" Purbright's gaze drifted over the leaflet. A list of proposed repairs included the Clocktower, the north transept roof, the old municipal pump, and, to his surprise, the records room in the town hall basement. "Curious," he murmured. "What is, sir?" Mally leaned in. "That the records room is included. It has been ignored for decades. Forgotten except by the archivist and the occasional rat. Yet here it is, suddenly a priority." Mally frowned. What would the records have to do with a dead watchmaker? "That," said Purbright, "is what we must discover." They headed toward the town hall where the caretaker, Mr. Buchan, greeted them with a dour nod. He led them down a dim corridor to the basement records. The door creaked open reluctantly. Dust motes swirled in the stale air. Boxes lined the walls, each labeled in faded ink. Property deeds, committee minutes, registry of civic works. Purbright ran a finger along one lid, tracing the dust patterns. "Has anyone been down here recently?" he asked. Buchan sniffed. "Only myself yesterday morning. A gentleman wanted to see some old property ledgers, something about historical boundary lines." "Did he give a name?" "Said it was official business from the Preservation Initiative. I didn't think to question him. He seemed professional." Purbright exchanged a glance with Mally. "Tall fellow? Sharp face?" "Yes," Buchan said, surprised. "Do you know him?" "We hope to," Purbright replied gently. He examined the nearest open ledger on the central table. The page bore faint impressions where papers had once lain flat, recently removed. A slight indentation caught his eye, a curved flourish matching precisely the emblem printed on Lenton's leaflets. "Sergeant," Purbright said softly, "someone has been using the Preservation Initiative as a convenient disguise." Mally looked around, alarmed. "Why here? Why the records?" Purbright closed the ledger carefully. "Because something in these boxes mattered enough for a man to retrieve it quietly, and for another man, Grevett, to be drawn into a fatal appointment at the tower." He moved toward the stairs, slowing only to give the room one last, thoughtful glance. "Sergeant," he said, "we must find that tall stranger before he decides to vanish entirely, and we must speak with Mr. Lenton again, this time about what he might not realize he knows." The mystery, like the dust in the records room, was thickening. And somewhere among these ledgers, Purbright sensed, lay the motive that would bring the Clocktower's deadly secret into the light. Purbright left the records room with the careful gait of a man carrying more conclusions than he wished yet to share. Sergeant Mally followed, glancing back once or twice as though expecting the dim basement to reveal one final clue before the door swung shut. But nothing more spoke from the dust. Whatever had been taken was gone, and whatever purpose it served was now folded neatly into someone's private scheme. They stepped into the cooler air of the town hall corridor. Purbright paused beneath a framed portrait of a former mayor whose whiskers suggested he had opposed progress on principle. "Sergeant," Purbright said quietly, "we must assume our tall stranger had access to Lenton's materials. Perhaps even copied his emblem. That suggests planning, some knowledge of how to arrange a meeting without drawing suspicion." Mally nodded but looked troubled. "But why involve Grevett at all, sir? Why a watch repairer?" "Because someone needed not just a witness, but a technician," Purbright replied. "Someone skilled enough to understand what was done to the clock, or what was to be done." Mally's brows drew together. "But the mechanism was smashed to bits. What's to understand about that?" "Intent," Purbright murmured. "The intention behind destruction can reveal more than the destruction itself." They exited the hall and crossed toward the high street again, the sun now sliding into a soft afternoon haze. Purbright's steps angled almost unconsciously toward Galloway and Sons. The printer's window contained fresh leaflets, still smelling faintly of ink, bearing the same ornate emblem that Grevitt had torn in half. Inside, Mr. Galloway himself stood at the counter, a stout man with forearms thick from decades of wrangling paper that preferred to curl. He brightened when he saw the inspector. "Afternoon, Inspector. Hope nothing's amiss." Purbright offered a small, soothing smile. "Only routine inquiries, Mr. Galloway. You printed the Preservation Initiative leaflets, I believe?" "I did indeed. Young Lenton wanted them in a hurry. Always in a hurry, that one, though his shoes suggest otherwise." Purbright lifted a leaflet and tapped the emblem. "This design, did you create it?" "Good heavens, no. The lad brought it to me ready-made. Said a supporter of the cause designed it. He was rather vague." "Was the supporter tall?" Purbright asked softly. "Sharp-featured? A little impatient with formalities?" Galloway frowned, thinking, "Now that you say it. A man did come in 2 days ago with notes on how the emblem should be placed. Didn't give a name. He wasn't unfriendly, just brisk. Looked like someone accustomed to being obeyed. Paid in cash." "Did he collect any printed sheets himself?" "Oh, yes," Galloway said. "Asked for a small batch early. Proofs, he claimed, though it was a larger number than I'd usually call proofs. 50 or 60, perhaps." Malley exhaled. "Enough to tear into pieces for notes, sir." "Quite so," Purbright murmured. "Do you recall anything else about him?" Malley pressed. Galloway thought again. He asked directions to the town hall archives. Very particular directions. Wanted to know when they were least occupied. Purbright thanked him, then stepped back onto the street with Malley close behind. "So the stranger planned his visit," Malley said. "Used Lenton's cause as cover, printed his own leaflets, and went to the records room deliberately. But why take Grevitt along?" "The question," Purbright replied, "is not why Grevitt, but why the tower." They continued down the street, turning toward the churchyard, drawn back to the tower as if by invisible thread. Purbright's mind rearranged the fragments. Grevitt uneasy before leaving the boarding house, the mysterious caller, the torn emblem, and the deliberate sabotage of the clock mechanism. When they reached St. Crispin's, the afternoon shadows fell long across the grass. A few committed gossipers still lingered at the lich gate, though they pretended intense interest in the flower beds whenever Purbright appeared in view. The vicar, Reverend Elgrange, emerged from the vestry looking exhausted. His expression brightened faintly when he saw the inspector. "Inspector, have you made any progress? The congregation is in quite a state. Mrs. Kendall keeps asking if the bell should be exercised." Purbright smiled politely. "No need for ecclesiastical dramatics, Reverend. A more earthly explanation is emerging, but I do require one thing: access to the tower's maintenance records." Elgrange blinked. "Maintenance records. Such as they are, they're kept in the vestry cupboard. Harting complains about them constantly." "I would appreciate a look," Purbright said. Inside the vestry, the vicar rummaged through a cupboard before withdrawing a thin ledger and handing it over with the air of presenting something unpleasant but necessary. Purbright flipped, through it slowly, scanning Harting's neat entries. Dates, minor repairs, winding schedules. And then, Purbright paused, one recent note, Thursday 9 hours p.m. Found mechanism disturbed, minor adjustment made, door latch stiff, must request replacement. "Reverend?" Purbright said softly. "Did anyone know about this disturbance?" "No," Elgrange admitted. "Harting mentioned something about a loose hinge, but not sabotage." Purbright traced the words with his thumb. "Someone was in the tower 2 nights ago, before Grevitt's involvement. Testing something, perhaps." Malley looked startled. "Testing what, sir?" "Possibly whether the clock could be stopped or silenced at a chosen time," Purbright replied. "A test run." Elgrange covered his mouth. Inspector, are you suggesting this was planned? Purbright closed the ledger quietly. Reverend, someone engineered a demonstration that required the clock to fail at a precise moment, 10:30, when the maximum number of townspeople would hear the chime that never came. A warning? Elgrange whispered. A message, Purbright said. Mally frowned. For the council, sir? Perhaps. Purbright's gaze drifted upward toward the tower. If someone wished to show that the tower was unsafe, dangerously so, it would strengthen any argument for urgent repair funds. But our saboteur went further. He lured a man there, a technician, a witness. Elgrange went pale. You mean Grevitt died because someone wanted to frighten the council? No, Purbright said gently. He died because he knew too much, or because he saw too much. The vicar sank onto a bench. Mally looked at Purbright with the dawning unease of a man glimpsing the outline of a larger plot. Sir, if the saboteur wanted attention, why hide his face? Why all this secrecy? Purbright replied softly, because he wants the repairs funded, but not the blame. He wants urgency, but not suspicion. A man who wishes to appear a savior must first create peril. A silence settled in the vestry. Then Purbright folded the ledger under his arm. Sergeant, our next call will be Mr. Harting, and after that, the councillors, particularly those who oppose the repairs. He walked to the door, pausing only once. And we must find the tall stranger before he presents the town with a second demonstration. The clock tower's shadow stretched across the churchyard, long and thin, like a warning finger pointing towards secrets not yet spoken. Purbright and Sergeant Mally left the vestry with the maintenance ledger tucked neatly beneath the inspector's arm. The churchyard felt cooler now, as though the tower's long shadow had leached a little warmth from the air. Purbright paused briefly, looking up toward the narrow windows high above. They stared down blankly, giving nothing away. Yet something about them felt watchful, as though the tower itself were withholding its last pieces of truth until Purbright approached with the correct question. Best speak with Harting next, sir, Mally asked, already bracing himself for the electrician's temper. Yes, Purbright said, though I suspect he may tell us less than we need and more than he realizes. They made their way toward Old Brewery Lane again. The afternoon light had softened, giving the street an amber stillness. When Harting's cottage came into view, it looked unchanged, ivy clinging stubbornly, chimney smoking faintly. But the door, which earlier had been answered by a wary Harting, now stood ajar. Purbright halted. Mally moved a step forward instinctively. Not his style, sir, Mally murmured. Harting doesn't leave doors open. No, Purbright agreed. Let us announce ourselves. He knocked gently. When no reply came, he stepped inside, Mally close behind. The cottage interior was in disarray. Not violently so, but with the unmistakable look of someone having rifled through cupboards and drawers with hurried precision. A few papers lay scattered on the small table. A toolkit had been tipped over, its contents neatly sifted and left on the floor as if rejected one by one. Harting? Purbright called softly. A reply came only from a wall clock ticking steadily above the mantel. Mally looked around, jaw tightening. He's gone, sir. Purbright bent to examine the papers on the table. They were maintenance notes, sketched diagrams of the clock mechanism, and a few terse letters from the council rejecting Harting's requests for funding. Nothing here suggested the man had left willingly, but something else did. Near the hearth lay a leaflet, one of Lenton's, crumpled but unopened. Purbright lifted it. The paper bore a faint, oily thumbprint. Fresh, he murmured. Mally was already scanning the room for other signs. Someone wanted something from him, sir, and he either gave it or made trouble for them. Purbright slipped the leaflet into his coat. We must assume Harting met our tall stranger, or was forced to do so. Abducted? Mally asked, voice dropping. Purbright considered. more likely persuaded. Harting is stubborn but not foolish. If threatened, he might comply rather than resist. He walked through the cottage, noting what was missing. Harting's work coat, his heaviest tool kit, and, most noticeably, the key to the clock tower. Mally stared at the empty hook beside the door. He took the key with him. Or someone insisted he bring it. Purbright turned slowly, surveying the room one last time. His gaze settled on a small brass gear lying alone on the windowsill, as though placed there with unusual care. He inspected it, then looked up sharply. "This isn't from the tower," he said. "Too small. More like from a carriage clock." Mally frowned. "Meaning Harting works on things besides the tower?" "Meaning," Purbright replied quietly, "he may have brought this from somewhere else, or someone showed it to him." He slipped the gear into his pocket. "Sergeant, we must widen our field. If the saboteur used the Preservation Initiative as a disguise to access the archives, he may have used Harting to gain access to something else entirely." Mally blinked. "Something besides the tower?" "Yes. Something kept locked. Something Harting could access." They left the cottage. Purbright paused at the front gate, eyes narrowing as he surveyed the street. "Mally, who else in Flaxborough depends heavily on old records, especially property records?" Mally scratched his head. "Developers? The council? Lawyers? Anyone trying to dispute a boundary?" He stopped. "Sir, Frobisher mentioned boundary lines this morning. Didn't he say something about disagreements in that council meeting?" "He did," Purbright said, "which is why we shall speak with the planning committee. But first," he looked toward the railway yard in the distance, where the lines converged like threads on a loom, "we must revisit the place where Grevitt lived. Someone besides the tall stranger may have sought him out there." They retraced their route to Mrs. Bostwick's boarding house. The landlady opened the door at once, her expression shifting from anticipatory sorrow to mild confusion. "Inspector? Oh, you've returned. More terrible news?" "Not yet," Purbright said gently. "Has anyone else asked after Mr. Grevitt since we left?" Mrs. Bostwick's eyes widened. "Well, yes. A man came not long after. Tall, sharp-faced, looked rather cross. I told him the police had been and that Albert was, well, gone." Purbright exchanged a look with Mally. "What did he say to that?" "He didn't speak at first. Just stared at me. Then he asked if Albert had left anything in his room. I said no, certainly not, and that officers had already examined it. Then he left. Quite abruptly." "Which direction did he go?" Purbright asked. "Toward the station." Purbright absorbed this with a quiet stillness. "Sergeant, I believe our man intends to leave town, and he may not be alone." Mally stiffened. "Harting? Possibly. Or Harting may already be disposed of. But the tall stranger is not done yet. He retrieved something from the records. He attempted a demonstration with the clock. He sought Grevitt and Harting, and now he flees." Purbright stepped outside, looking toward the faint column of steam rising above the station. "Mally, we must intercept him." They hurried toward the station, weaving through narrow streets now cooling in the late afternoon. As they approached the platform entrance, Purbright slowed. A train was arriving, its hiss and groan filling the air, drowning the softer sounds of the town. Passengers shifted impatiently. Steam curled along the platform edges like creeping fog. Then Purbright saw him, tall, sharp-featured, standing beside the parcels trolley, scanning the crowd with a tense, watchful stillness. He held Harting's missing satchel. Purbright motioned Mally back a step, lowering his voice. "We must approach carefully. If cornered, he may act rashly. But if he boards the train—" "I have no intention of allowing that," Purbright said softly. He stepped forward just as the man turned, catching sight of him. A flicker of recognition crossed the stranger's face, followed instantly by calculation. He shifted the satchel, edging closer to the departing passengers. Purbright raised a hand. "Good afternoon," he said, tone calm but carrying. "Might we have a word?" For an instant the man hesitated, caught between flight and confrontation. Then he fled, and Purbright, with the faintest sigh, began to follow. The stranger moved with a startling swiftness, weaving through clusters of arriving passengers with the dexterity of someone accustomed to slipping past obstacles and, perhaps, justice. Purbright followed at a brisk but measured pace, not running, for he knew that desperation made for clumsy decisions. Mally, however, darted ahead like an enthusiastic terrier, calling out, "Police, stand aside," in a voice that sent two elderly ladies into brief hysterics. The tall man pushed toward the far end of the platform, where a disused gate opened onto a service lane. He glanced back once, his expression now stripped of calculation and lined unmistakably with fear, or something very close to it. The satchel thudded against his hip with each step. Purbright raised his voice, calm but carrying. "You need not run. This will end better for you if you allow it to end now." The stranger did not slow. Instead, he yanked open the rusted gate and slipped through, leaving Mally shouting and struggling to follow as the old hinges resisted his efforts. Purbright reached the gate just as Mally forced it open with a pained metallic screech. "He's heading toward the goods yard, sir." Purbright nodded once. "Stay behind me, Sergeant. He may be armed, or worse, cornered." Beyond the gate, the service lane sloped downward between tall stacks of wooden crates and abandoned shipment pallets. The stranger bolted across the gravel, skidding dangerously but keeping his balance. A freight wagon sat idling nearby, its engine humming like a patient animal awaiting instructions. Before Purbright could call out again, the man veered sharply left, disappearing behind a stack of timber. Mally sprinted in pursuit, but Purbright held out an arm. "Slowly, Sergeant. A frightened man may lash out." They advanced with caution, rounding the stack just as the stranger stumbled to a halt. The lane ended abruptly at a wire mesh fence bordering the riverbank. The water below rushed steadily, indifferent to human dilemmas. The man clasped the satchel to his chest and turned, his breath rasping, his hair plastered to his forehead. For the first time, Purbright saw something other than calculation in him, something rawer, keener, a cornered creature's instinctive fury. "Stay back," the man hissed. Purbright stopped several paces away. "We only wish to talk." "I know what you want," the man snapped. "You think I killed him, or Harting, or both." "We know only that you were present," Purbright said calmly, "and that you possess property belonging to at least one of them." He nodded toward the satchel. The man clutched it tighter. This has nothing to do with murder." Purbright tilted his head. "Then you will not mind handing it over." For a moment the stranger's grip slackened, but suspicion reasserted itself quickly. "No, you'll twist it. You'll twist everything, just like they did." "Who?" Purbright asked gently. The man swallowed hard, eyes darting between the inspector, the fence, and the open sky. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I tried to stop them. I tried to warn Grevitt, but he insisted on seeing it for himself." "Seeing what?" The man pressed the satchel against his forehead, as though hoping its contents might provide courage. "The plans," he muttered. "The truth about the land, the fraud they've built their fortunes on. Decades of lies buried in the archives." Purbright exchanged a subtle glance with Mally. "You took documents from the records room?" "Yes," the man breathed, "because they show everything. The altered boundary lines, the claims Frobisher and his friends made on land that wasn't theirs to claim. They're planning to redevelop, expand, profit, all hidden under layers of committee minutes and misfiled deeds. I found the proof." "And Grevitt," Purbright said softly. The man's eyes squeezed shut. "He didn't believe me at first, thought I was raving. Then he agreed to go to the tower with me this morning, somewhere private, somewhere no one would overhear. He said he'd verify the stamps, the ink, the age of the papers. He had an incredible eye. Purbright remained still. And what happened? Someone was already there. The man's voice cracked. The mechanism had been tampered with. Grevitt reached toward it. He said something wasn't right. Then the gears gave way. I tried to grab him, I swear it, but the whole structure collapsed. I panicked. I ran. Malley stepped forward. You left him there to die. I thought he was already dead, the man cried. And if they knew I'd been with him, they'd silence me too. And Harting? Purbright asked. The stranger hesitated. Harting knew something was off. He'd seen the tower disturbed earlier in the week. I went to warn him, to make him help expose the fraud, but, he faltered. He refused to come, said he'd stay and gather more evidence. But he gave me the satchel, said I'd need it if anything happened to him. Purbright's expression did not change. And has anything happened to him? The man looked away. I don't know. When I went back, his house was empty. Drawers pulled open. Someone else must have been searching for the documents. Purbright felt the weight of a new thread slipping neatly into the tapestry of the case. The man might be lying, but not entirely. His fear had the ring of lived truth. Give me the satchel, Purbright said gently. You will be safe if you cooperate. The stranger hesitated, then, with trembling hands, extended the satchel toward him. Just as Purbright reached for it, footsteps thundered behind them. 3 men emerged from between the crates, broad-shouldered, purposeful, dressed in council maintenance jackets that looked just a shade too new. Their faces held the practiced blankness of men who had been given instructions not to interpret. Malley's hand went instinctively to his baton. The stranger froze, eyes wide with recognition and dread. Purbright stepped forward calmly, blocking the newcomer's path to the man. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Might we be of some assistance? The one in front, a thick-necked fellow with cold, pale eyes, spoke with oily politeness. Council business, Inspector. That man has property belonging to the town. We're here to retrieve it. Purbright's voice remained calm, but a subtle steel hardened its edges. If the property is evidence, it belongs to the police. And you, he added gently, are dangerously far from your remit. The man's polite mask slipped. Hand it over. Purbright took the satchel from the stranger and clasped it behind his back. No. A fraught silence settled. Malley shifted closer. Ready. One of the men took a step forward, fists tightening. Purbright didn't blink. Gentlemen, he said softly, you may walk away now, or you may stay and learn how very quickly obstruction becomes arrest. The 3 men exchanged a brief, uneasy glance and decided retreat was the better part of loyalty. They backed away, then vanished between the crates as swiftly as they'd appeared. Purbright let out a slow breath. Sergeant, he murmured, take this gentleman into protective custody. He has more to tell. Malley nodded and moved to escort the shaken man. Purbright glanced at the satchel. Heavy, paper-filled, and waiting to reveal precisely whose secrets had demanded the silence of St. Crispin's Clocktower. Purbright closed the clasp gently. Now, he murmured, we proceed to the truth. Purbright returned to the constabulary with the satchel held carefully beneath his arm, as though it were a fragile heirloom rather than a bag of stolen or rescued documents. Sergeant Malley escorted the shaken stranger, whose name, they learned on the walk back, was Leonard Strake. He said it with a sort of hushed resignation, as if confessing to a minor trespass rather than introducing himself. Inside the station, Purbright led them to his office. The room maintained its usual air of quiet order, papers arranged in non-threatening stacks, a kettle in the corner murmuring contentedly to itself, and a clock that ticked in a far more reassuring manner than the one in St. Crispin's tower. "Sit, Mr. Strake," Purbright said gently, gesturing to a chair. Strake obeyed. He looked thin in the soft afternoon light. His sharp features softened only slightly now that he no longer feared immediate pursuit. Mally stood by the door, half guard and half observer. Purbright placed the satchel on the table and opened it. Inside, bound with string in small stacks, were old maps, property deeds, and several sheets bearing the looping emblem found on the Preservation Initiative leaflets. He removed the top bundle and examined it. "These," he murmured, "were certainly taken from the records room. Some of them, judging by the dust impressions, quite recently." Strake nodded weakly. "I told you. They're proof." "Proof?" Purbright repeated calmly. "Of what, precisely?" Strake swallowed, gathering himself. "The council's redevelopment proposal for the land near the river. On paper, it looks legitimate. Public benefit, employment, all that. But the land was never theirs to sell, Inspector. The boundary lines were altered decades ago. I found the original deeds. They show the land belongs to the old mill estate, which was never properly dissolved. Someone on the committee stood to gain a great deal by ensuring those documents stayed hidden." Mally frowned. But why sabotage the Clocktower? Strake let out a shaky breath. Because they needed urgency. If the tower seemed dangerously unstable, if it lost its chime at the busiest moment, they could argue for immediate demolition, and with the demolition would come redevelopment rights. Once the tower was condemned, the surrounding land could be rezoned. It would all look like civic improvement. Purbright nodded slowly. A staged failure to provide justification. Clever in a deeply unfortunate way. Strake rubbed his temples. Grevitt was supposed to verify the authenticity of the documents. He said he'd check the ink in the paper, see if the stamps matched the era. He didn't realize someone else would be waiting in the tower. "And Harting?" Purbright asked. Strake hesitated. Harting wasn't part of this. He just knew something had been tampered with. He warned me that the mechanism had been disturbed earlier, told me to be careful. Purbright leaned forward slightly. "You said Harting gave you the satchel?" "Yes. He said I should take it somewhere safe, that he'd keep watch for anyone following me." Purbright exchanged a glance with Mally. It appears Harting understood the danger more fully than he expressed. Strake closed his eyes, guilt pressing hard. "If anything's happened to him—" "We shall find him," Purbright said gently. "But understand this. By fleeing the tower, you positioned yourself terribly close to suspicion." Strake looked up, fear flickering again. I thought they'd kill me." Mally, for once, spoke softly. "Best you're here now." Purbright opened another bundle of documents. One sheet showed a precise boundary drawing, the riverbank marked in red. Another bore signatures, councillors' signatures, dated 20 years apart, the latter suspiciously identical to the earlier ones, as though copied. "I believe you're correct, Mr. Strake," Purbright murmured. "Forgery is a persuasive tool, particularly when used upon records rarely examined." Strake nodded mutely. Purbright stood, pacing slowly to the kettle and switching it on. "Sergeant, kindly ask Constable Pritchard to bring in Mr. Lenton. I suspect he may have unknowingly been entangled in this." Mally went at once. Purbright poured tea, handing a cup to Strake. The man accepted it with both hands, as though warming himself after a long chill. After several quiet sips, Purbright spoke again. "Tell me, how did you come across these documents? You are not, I gather, a regular visitor to Flaxborough." Strake shook his head. "I'm an assistant surveyor for a firm in Grimberton. We were reviewing regional maps for a rail spur proposal. When I checked Flaxborough's boundaries, something didn't match the county records. Thought it was a clerical error at first. Then I came here, saw the Preservation Initiative posters. Thought maybe the tower's restoration plans had triggered new surveys. But when I checked the archives, I found those deeds, and I realized someone had gone to considerable trouble to conceal them." Purbright listened intently. "You informed no one else?" No one. I thought telling the wrong person could get me killed. His voice cracked, and it did get someone killed. Purbright placed a steady hand on the table. Mr. Strake, Grevitt's death lies upon the shoulders of those who set the trap. Not upon yours, and we shall see that truth made plain. At that moment, Mally returned with Cyril Lenton in tow. The young man looked bewildered and slightly alarmed, clutching his tie as though it were a lifeline. Inspector, Sergeant Mally said I was needed urgently. Am I in trouble? No trouble, Purbright said kindly. Only questions. He gestured for Lenton to sit. I understand, Purbright began, that a man you believed was a supporter of your initiative brought you the emblem for your leaflets. Lenton flushed. Yes, said he was a benefactor, very keen on heritage matters. Did he ask you to file anything with the council? Petitions, maps, proposals? Yes, he gave me a set of amended boundary, sketches. Said they'd show the council how much land could be restored for public use. Purbright tapped the satchel. Did he give you these? Lenton glanced at the contents, eyes widening. Some of those look familiar. But no, he took them back. Said he needed to revise them. Purbright nodded slowly. Mr. Lenton, the man who posed as your benefactor was using your initiative as camouflage for a much larger scheme. Lenton paled. I swear I didn't know. We know, Purbright said gently. But your materials helped him reach the archives without suspicion. Lenton lowered his head with a soft, miserable groan. I thought I was helping the town. You may yet, Purbright replied. He looked toward the satchel again. It is time now, he said quietly, to confront those who hoped this scheme would succeed. But we shall do so carefully. Councillors do not enjoy confession, especially not when motivated by profit. He closed the satchel gently. Sergeant, he said, assemble the committee. We shall meet with them before dusk. I believe the Clocktower's silence has spoken long enough. Mally nodded, determination tightening his jaw. Strake watched Purbright with a mixture of relief and awe. And Purbright, quiet, thoughtful, and orderly as ever, felt the shape of the truth settling into place. The reveal was drawing near. The council chamber, normally a home for tepid debates about lamp-posts and hedge trimming, felt unusually solemn as Inspector Purbright stepped inside. A long oak table stretched beneath dim pendant lights. Councillor Frobisher sat at its head, trying to look unruffled, but succeeding only in appearing poultice-like and damp. Two other councillors hovered nearby, murmuring anxiously. Sergeant Mally stood at Purbright's side, steady and silent. At the far end of the room, Leonard Strake waited under quiet guard, looking far more composed now that he was no longer running for his life. Cyril Lenton hovered in a corner as if reluctant to touch any furniture for fear it might implicate him somehow. Purbright placed the brown satchel on the table and gently drew out the bundles of documents. The councillors stiffened. Gentlemen, Purbright began mildly, I trust this will not take long. There are matters which must be clarified. Matters concerning the Clocktower, the archives, and a land redevelopment proposal of, shall we say, unusual provenance. Frobisher's mustache twitched. Inspector, if this is about that distressing business at the church— It is, Purbright said, and about matters stretching rather beyond it. He unfolded one of the boundary maps and tapped his finger lightly upon a red line. You have, for some years, been attempting to secure redevelopment permission for the riverfront. A contentious matter, I believe. Frobisher puffed up. Contentious? Hardly. The council always strives to— Your predecessor, Purbright continued softly, signed a boundary approval 20 years ago, a signature identical, remarkably identical, to one dated 40 years ago by a different official. The match is so perfect, I suspect even a printing plate would blush at the comparison. The councillors blinked, the colour draining from one face, gathering in blotches on another. Purbright lifted a second document. These deeds show the riverfront land belongs not to the council, as you have claimed, but to the old mill estate. That estate was never dissolved, its holdings never ceded. The redevelopment plan, therefore, depended upon the disappearance of these documents. And so, he folded the map with delicate care. Someone arranged precisely that. Frobisher sputtered. This is a monstrous accusation. It grows less monstrous when one considers the Clocktower, Purbright said. A symbol of the town, a protected landmark. Its demolition would require extraordinary justification. He stepped aside so that Mally could place the maintenance ledger on the table. 2 nights ago, Purbright continued, someone disturbed the mechanism, tested it, and this morning at 10:30, when a large portion of the town was gathered within earshot, the mechanism collapsed. Conveniently, one might say, for anyone wishing to demonstrate that the tower was unsafe. Councillor Briggs, a wiry man with nervous spectacles, swallowed audibly. You can't prove that was deliberate? I can, Purbright said, and will. He opened the satchel again and withdrew a small tool, one so fine it scarcely looked capable of harm. This sliver was found in the debris, a watchmaker's tool, but not used by a watchmaker, used against him. Strake exhaled shakily. Purbright's voice remained quiet. Albert Grevitt was lured to the tower under the pretext of verifying documents. Documents someone feared he might authenticate. He found the mechanism already sabotaged. He died not because the clock failed, but because someone required it to fail. Frobisher's face flushed a mottled crimson. You have no evidence connecting us to the 3 men who confronted Mr. Strake at the goods yard, Purbright said, were wearing council maintenance jackets. Their supervisor, I understand, is closely connected to this committee, and their orders, he watched Frobisher carefully, were evidently clear. Mally stepped forward. Sir, all 3 are in custody. One has admitted they were told to retrieve the documents before the inspector could meddle. The room froze. Frobisher turned slowly toward Councillor Briggs, whose spectacles fogged in panic. Councillor Hainsworth shifted in his seat, guilt flickering across his features like a faulty lamplight. Purbright folded his hands serenely. Gentlemen, greed is a remarkably industrious creature. It seeks opportunity wherever it can, grow quietly and undisturbed, but when threatened by exposure, it grows reckless. Briggs slumped. We didn't plan for anyone to be hurt. Ah, Purbright murmured. But someone was hurt. 2 people at least. One killed, another endangered, and Harting, who is now safe, by the way, though shaken, was pressured into cooperating with your scheme. He fled when he realized someone had broken into his cottage. He feared the same fate as Grevitt. A collective gasp rippled around the table. Rest assured, Purbright continued, he's under police protection and willing to testify. Frobisher sagged into his chair, defeated. It was supposed to be simple, he muttered. Just a demonstration, a harmless one. In Flaxborough, Purbright said gently, I find that any scheme described as harmless is rarely so. He signaled to Mally, who stepped forward with quiet authority. One by one, the councillors who had colluded, Briggs, Hainsworth, and a reluctant Frobisher, were escorted out, their protests now small, weary things. When the room had emptied, Purbright remained standing, gazing at the satchel. Strake stepped forward hesitantly. Will the town be all right, Inspector? Purbright smiled faintly. Flaxborough is very resilient. It has endured worse. From flower show rivalries to council budgets, it will recover from this too. And the tower? It will be repaired, Purbright said. Properly this time, without theatrics. Lenton approached nervously. Inspector, am I still needed? I didn't know any of this. Purbright gave him a kindly nod. You are quite safe, Mr. Lenton, and perhaps your initiative will now receive the honest support it deserves. The young man brightened. Modestly, like a small fire learning to trust its own flame. After the others had gone, Mally closed the chamber door and sighed with relief. "That was tidy work, sir." Purbright shook his head gently. "No, Sergeant. Untidy work. Very untidy. But truth, once found, tends to brush itself off." Mally chuckled softly. "Will you be coming back to the station, sir?" "In a moment," Purbright said. "I should like a quiet walk first." He stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sun hovered low, and St. Crispin's Clocktower, its mechanism broken but its dignity unbowed, cast a long shadow across the square. Purbright paused to admire the tower's silhouette, hands clasped behind his back. "A pity," he murmured, "that some men believe progress must be built upon silence." A breeze stirred, carrying with it the distant murmurs of townsfolk, still discussing the day's excitement. Tomorrow they would return to worries about milk deliveries and hedgerow gossip, and Purbright, as always, would return to paperwork and quiet contemplation. But tonight he allowed himself a small, weary smile. Flaxborough, in all its peculiarities, was once again safe from those who underestimated its capacity for truth. He turned toward the constabulary, the last light catching briefly upon the broken clock face above. Its hands, frozen at 10:30, would soon move again. And so, in time, would Flaxborough.